Hello, I'm Lauren Rogers, and today I'm going to discuss the core principles of journalism. It's crucial that current and future journalists demonstrate fundamental comprehension of journalistic application. The First Amendment grants the press with a substantial amount of freedom from censorship and prior restraint. This means the government cannot block or control what the press decides to publish, and they cannot prevent the expression of ideas before they are published. This amount of freedom is accompanied by an even greater responsibility to practice ethical behavior. Media outlets must regulate themselves if they want to maintain credibility with the public and prevent future regulation from the government. So what is journalism, and why is a journalist's job so important? Journalism is the act of gathering, assessing, creating, and presenting news and information. Its purpose is to provide citizens with the information they need to make the best possible decisions about their lives, their communities, their societies, and their governments and world. According to the American Press Institute, there are key elements that separate journalism from other forms of communication. These elements make it essential to the execution of democratic societies. Let's take a look at the American Press Institute's key elements of journalism.
Journalism's first obligation is to the truth. Its first loyalty is to citizens. Its essence is a discipline of verification. Its practitioners must maintain an independence from those they cover. It must serve as an independent monitor of power. It must provide a forum for public criticism and compromise. It must strive to keep the significant interesting and relevant. It must keep the news comprehensive and proportional. Its practitioners must be allowed to exercise their personal conscience. And citizens, too, have rights and responsibilities when it comes to the news.
A lot is expected of journalists. An even balance of ethos, logos, and pathos is necessary in this line of work. Ethos appeals to ethics, logos appeals to logic, and pathos appeals to emotion. A journalist must convince their audience of their credibility by backing their arguments and information with facts and reason, and sometimes by evoking an emotional response. Journalists should avoid making commonplace assertions, which are statements or ideas that many or most people believe to be true, but cannot be backed by factual evidence. They must also avoid using loaded terms or rhetoric that uses words with strong positive or negative connotations intended to influence a reader's or listener's attitude through an emotional response. Experts believe that absolute neutrality and objectivity is impossible, and that some form of bias in the media is inevitable. The best way to minimize bias is to understand it at its core. Like many other professions, journalists are expected to live by a code of ethics. The code of ethics is in place to ensure that the spread of information is accurate, fair, and thorough. It's not meant to serve as a set of rules, but as a guideline for journalists to act with integrity. The Society of Professional Journalists has declared 4 core principles and encourages them in all forms of media. The first principle is to seek truth and report it. This means that ethical journalism should be accurate and fair. Journalists should be honest and courageous in gathering, reporting, and interpreting information.
This includes, but is not limited to, verifying information before releasing it, providing context and source material, supporting the open and civil exchange of views, avoiding stereotypes, and labeling advocacy and commentary.
It's important to remember that rushing to release the story first is never an excuse for inaccuracy. Releasing inaccurate information is harmful to the discourse of a democratic society and is the opposite of a journalist's objective. The second principle is to minimize harm. This means that ethical journalism treats sources, subjects, colleagues, and members of the public as human beings deserving of respect.
This includes, but is not limited to, maintaining a fair balance between the public's need for information and the potential risk of harm or damage it can cause, showing compassion and empathy for those who are directly affected by the news coverage, using caution and sensitivity when dealing with victims of sex crimes, juveniles, and sources that are inexperienced, and considering the long-term implications of the news coverage.
The third principle is to act independently. The highest and primary obligation of ethical journalism is to serve the public.
Journalists should always try to avoid conflicts of interest, refuse gifts, favors, and fees, deny favored treatment, and distinguish news from advertising.
And the fourth principle is to be accountable and transparent. Ethical journalism means taking responsibility for one's work and explaining one's decisions to the public.
Always be able to explain choices and processes to the public, encourage a civil dialogue, respond quickly to any questions concerning accuracy and fairness, provide clarity when needed, acknowledge mistakes and correct them immediately, and expose unethical journalistic conduct.
A journalist's duty is to keep the public informed on the important things that go on in our communities, societies, nations, and world. The extent to which a journalist should go to seek the truth and report it is paramount. How they decide to present that truth is up to them. Following the basic fundamentals of journalism and adhering to the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics will add value and credibility to the work of journalists in all forms of media. We owe it to the people to practice ethical, mindful, and responsible journalistic conduct. Thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Rogers.